Should I do an introduction here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I'll just say hi, Cobi. Welcome to the show.
Hi,
Um,
Danielle. Thanks for having me, per usual.
yeah. Glad to have you
So,
doing
go ahead.
legislative stuff again on the podcast. Or I guess this one's a YouTube, huh?
Yeah, I don't know if you can upload it to the podcast or not later, but yeah, this will primarily be YouTube, I guess.
Yeah, I can definitely just do the audio on the podcast.
Cool. Well, so this YouTuber is going to be a little bit different than the previous ones we did. The previous ones were more or less just audio dialogue of the podcast. On this one, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to share my screen, and we're actually going to look at what one of these letter of intents we've previously been talking about looks like, and go through it together so we can capture all of the nuance of these bills that we just have historically been spitballing.
I'm so here for this. This is like what I'm in the LP for, is all of these pieces of legislation and things that you're doing. So I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you hosting these videos and doing the editing.
Yeah.
We're going to review a proposal today, which is intended to solve a number of key problems that I think most people in our state perceive as key problems. And those are that we have a state that thinks it's okay to tell business owners how to run their business, what they can and can't wear. That seems to be a problem. We have countless homeless people living in destitute circumstances without support throughout the state. That is certainly a problem, and I think that's a self-evident problem if you spend any time in Seattle. We have a police force which spends countless dollars fighting nonviolent crime, which has no victim, while simultaneously failing to effectively serve justice for violent and coercive crime or destructive crime. And hopefully this proposal helps alleviate that to some degree. And additionally, we have a state that thinks it's okay to tell individuals what they can and can't do with their own bodies. And that doesn't seem very liberally enlightened to me. So I don't know if there's any disagreement about those, but the proposal I have today is hopefully going to do something to solve that to some degree.
Right.
We've worked with a number of key community stakeholders on this proposal, and we've determined that the best way to help alleviate some percentage of these problems is to decriminalize prostitution, to provide an optional method of licensure for sex workers who wish to participate in a legally regulated sex work environment, or also allow them to work in a decriminalized environment. And we'll talk a little bit about what the difference between those two environments are when we get into the bill, which I think I'll do here in a second. I do want to highlight, I think, that I understand that there's probably a moral objection to some degree from some people to the act of prostitution, and I'm not going to start talking about that. I think we will talk about that a little bit at the end and have a brief discussion about moral philosophy, but I think what I want to do first is highlight the objective merits of the bill and look at it from a strictly market-driven perspective, and then have a philosophical discussion very briefly at the end.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, that way we can just disconnect the feelings from it a little bit and hopefully help some people and solve some problems. That said, I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll start looking at what these proposals actually look like that we tend to talk about. I want to share a window, and I want to share that. Cool. You see this document that's held up here, letter of intent to draft proposed legislation?
Yes.
Awesome. So I do want to highlight one quick thing before I dig into the nitty-gritty details on this thing. And that is that this was written in March of 2021, so several months ago now. And since we wrote this, our department put this together, the state has already changed the law. And I'll talk a little bit about what they did here to this law and what I like about it and what I don't. But effective June 11th, 2020, which is after we put this together, they have already started incorporating some percentage of what I've written here into the new law. And it's incomplete, in my opinion. I'll talk about that when we get a little farther. The other highlight that I want to make is that the current RCW in Washington State, which makes prostitution illegal, is only effective until January 1st, 2024. And my intention here is to replace this with something that's more comprehensive and well thought out between now and 2024. And if you like what we've put together, like and subscribe and sign up for the Libertarian Party and send us money so we can lobby for you. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean, that sounds like a great goal. So 2024 is when we want to try to get this through.
Yes, that's right. So all that said, I'm going to dig into this now. The first paragraph that's on this document is pretty much just for internal use. You can pause the video and read that on your own if you want. I'm going to dig right into the intent, which we already talked about a little bit, but the intent is laid out here, and it would replace the RCW, which is expiring. I do also, when we go through the objective nature of this, and before we talk about moral philosophy, I'm going to talk about political philosophy a little bit, and what this bill does to adhere to libertarian values, to left-wing values, and right-wing values.
Oh, appreciate that.
So, yeah. So, for reference, this chapter doesn't just relate to prostitution, and I'm not sure if you can see the law on my screen. Can you see the law on my screen? Or
The
can you just
indecent
see
exposure?
Yes, perfect.
Hmm?
So the beginning of this chapter is indecent exposure and prostitution. And so the first part of this chapter I'm proposing we amend is the indecent exposure portion of it. And this is a pretty simple one that I think this state will agree with in general, or at least the majority of the state will agree with. But I've extrapolated on the definition of indecent exposure. The original definition was a person is guilty of indecent exposure if he or she intentionally makes any open and obscene exposure of his or her persons of another, knowing that such contact is likely to cause reasonable affront or alarm. And so that's pretty questionable about what qualifies as reasonable affront and alarm, and it's subjective. I have highlighted that exposing any part of the chest, torso, or nipple is not indecent exposure, regardless of gender. So let's take the guesswork out of that one, is more or less what I'm saying.
Well, and that's already on the books, right? Is at least in Seattle. So this would just kind of extend that across the state.
Yes, and Seattle basically gets away with that by virtue of the ambiguity in the current bill. I'm just taking the ambiguity out of it on the state level.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. So that's the first one. Additionally, I've added to this and said that it shall be illegal for the state, including any municipality, state-run institution, city, or county, to mandate that any private business conform to a specific form of dress code.
And that sort of has to do with those baristas in Everett that are being closed down because they wear bikinis, right? Or they're being forced to wear real clothes, I suppose.
Well, yeah, the state is basically telling a business what their employees can and can't wear of their own fruition, and that, to me, seems like crap. I mean, the state shouldn't be able to tell businesses what they can and can't wear. Anyway, that's part one. Part two, and this is the larger percentage of this. This is the actual prostitution section. Mm-hmm. So the first part here is prostitution may be, however, shall not be required to be and performed as a licensed practice within the state of Washington. So what I've done here, I've written this and rewritten this several times because we've talked with a number of community stakeholders and engaged with representatives of the sex work community to make sure that they agree with a lot of what's in this bill. And when I originally wrote it, it was just licensed practice only. And after talking with them, they made an incredible point, which was really kind of eye-opening, and that is that for the last 4 or 5 decades or so at least, the state as an entity has abused and beaten these people, mm-hmm. and in some cases raped them and then locked them up for it. And to expect those people to jump on board with the idea that the state is now going to protect them and their business interests is not going to happen. So what we've done is we've tried to create an incentive for the state to provide its services to these people while still respecting the fact that they want to work without state intervention. And so what we've done is we've created an environment in which a sex worker or a recipient of sex services can voluntarily get a license, can voluntarily choose to get a license or choose not to. And I'll go through the benefits of getting a license down below, but one of the key benefits is that it would allow them to operate as a business. So as a contractor, for example, if I do business with somebody and they don't pay me, I have lien rights and I can force them to pay me because they violated the terms of my agreement. If you're a sex worker and somebody doesn't pay you, you've been raped. And in my opinion, the state should defend that person. So, you know, that has some advantages, but in order for a sex worker or a sex service receiver to feel comfortable giving the state their information and effectively being put on a registry of licensees and licensors, that relationship's going to have to be rebuilt over time. And the state's going to have to build a rapport with these people. Now, you might say, well, what does the state get out of that? Or what does the community at large get out of that? And there's an excise tax that would be imposed on the act of sex work to fund not just the state's enforcement of various sex work practices, but also to provide for the needs of homeless folks. So I'll get to that in a minute here, but that's a little bit more of an elaboration on what the difference is between decriminalized and legal. If it's decriminalized, the police won't beat you up for doing it. If it's legal, the state will defend you if you're in agreement, if there's an agreement you've agreed to that's been violated. And this allows sex workers the option to do either. So that's part one. Are there any questions about that? Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit.
Oh, no. No, I think this is really great because that's kind of a huge libertarian thing for us, right? It's the whole opt-in, opt-out. So like, I super appreciate the fact that there is this opportunity to be licensed, but also the opportunity to just practice without being on a list. Because I was late to that meeting, but that was part of what I heard. So.
Yeah, and there are some people who I think would be willing to gamble and become licensed, but I think that's the minority of people.
Yeah.
And I think the only way that minority is going to grow is if the state shows, you know, some amount of respect for these service providers in the same manner that they show other businesses, and that's just going to take time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's part one. Part two here is that DOL, and this would all be administered through DOL, Department of Licensing, as would any other occupational license. But DOL would issue a license to provide sexual services to a licensed sex worker and a license to receive sexual services. And the purpose for having both is going to be clear here in a second. Part three, DOL shall not withhold approval for a license to provide sexual services within the state of Washington if an applicant meets the following criteria. Number one is 18 years of age or older and of sound mind. And originally there was a complaint about my comment here, and of sound mind. And the reason for that is that there are some individuals who, well, that's the recipients. I'm sorry, I'll get to that later. But that's part one. Part two is free of any STDs or STIs. Licensee may submit a report every 30 days to DOL indicating they have not contracted any new STDs or STIs, has never been convicted of a violent crime. And prior to issuing a license to practice prostitution, the state shall offer a safe space to interview the applicant. The interview will be administered as an opportunity for any applicant to report a history of coercion, abuse, free from any worry of being implicated for previously providing sex work or of previously being involved in a different form of criminal activity. Additionally, the state may collect data related to the reason why an individual wishes to become a sex worker. However, such information shall not be used as a basis to prevent the issuance of a license. So this must be an older version. I added to this section here about free of STDs and STIs. A sex worker can still have an STD or STI and receive a license under this proposal. It would just need to be disclosed on the license. That way, anybody who's engaging with that sex worker is aware of the risks associated with engaging with that sex worker and will know to wear a condom or something like that. So this license is in effect intended to provide for the safety of everyone engaged in the practice of sex work, and also provide as a tool for sex workers to use to enforce their transactions as any other business would.
I do think folks will appreciate the of sound mind part for the sex workers as well, because I know you are going to address disabilities later, but there are definitely individuals with disabilities who can be coerced into stuff that definitely seem of sound mind, but until they get into this interview, that might be, negotiated. So
that's right. And before I keep going down my bill, this is actually the section where I want to give the state credit where credit is due. So the part that the state has changed, which is effective June 1st, 2020, is that the act of prostitution has been redefined as a person aged 18 or older is guilty of prostitution if such person engages or agrees to offers and engage in sexual conduct. And people who are unfamiliar with why this is relevant, if you were a child who was abused, or if there was an individual who was abused as a child and coerced into being a prostitute, the child is not rational and is not of sound mind, then that child could still be convicted of prostitution and would not be able, and that caused a particularly nefarious situation in which a child was being abused and was unable to go to the state for help because that child was going to be convicted of a crime if they did so. And that child's abusers would use that as a tool over the top of that child's head in an effort to continue abusing them. And that is pretty screwed up. And the state has attempted to fix that here. And they've actually implemented a whole new law about commercially sexually exploited children. And they're opening a number of different facilities which are intended to provide for this safe space that I'm talking about. So the good news here is that this isn't a new idea and funds have already been committed to provide for this. The bad news is that this particular bill, number one, only regards the coercion of children. Even if you're older than 18, you can still be coerced into the act of prostitution, and this would not provide you immunity in that event. In other words, that same dynamic in which a child is being abused can be applied to an adult. And this new law doesn't provide a defense for those people. So that should be fixed. Number two, this also doesn't solve anything for people who have historically been abused under the previous law. So there's nothing in here which would exonerate those individuals in an effort to put the people who are trafficking them or abusing them behind bars. So anyway, this is what the state has done effective June, a month ago or so, is a good first step, but I think it was not fully thought out. And I think there's still a place for this section of the bill that we put together here. And I think given an opportunity to send a lobbyist from our party to the state, we could work with the new committee who was created to help facilitate this new law and really do a lot of good. So that's that one. This also speaks a little bit to the previous intent. I talked a little bit about how the state spends a lot of money fighting voluntary, nonviolent crime that doesn't have a victim. What the state is doing is they're spending dollars putting prostitutes behind bars for voluntary exchange, while simultaneously preventing them from being able to help put actual violent coercive people behind bars who are forcing them into prostitution. So this solves that problem by allowing people to be prostitutes and providing a mechanism for those people to put their abusers in jail, which will hopefully save state resources and make it easier for the state to fight crime. Liberty and justice for all, right?
Yes. Or if you're me and you write protest signs on the day of the protest, you say freedom and justice for all and look like a big old dummy.
No problem. Anyway, so that's part 3. Part 4 here, the DOL will assist in facilitating the screening and approval of people who licensed sex workers wish to employ under their practice. DOL should provide following timely screening services on behalf of the licensee. So if you're a sex worker and you wish to hire people to facilitate your business, whether that's a CPA or an accountant or a bouncer, or whoever it might be, the state will provide a criminal background check for you and enter their fingerprints into the state fingerprint directory for you. Now, this also ties back here to the previous convictions clause of what we talked about previously. Hopefully people who were previously convicted of sex work would receive immunity under this proposal. And so in other words, if you had previously been convicted of sex work, you would be a criminal, and then that would theoretically disqualify you from a license. That's not the intent of this. If you were formerly a sex worker, you would be absolved, so to speak, and you would qualify for a license. This fingerprint directory and criminal background check is specifically for prior violent crime. Part 5 here is a little bit of a long one. In order to ensure the safety of sex workers, any individual who wishes to solicit the services of a sex worker must have a consumer's license issued by DOL. The criteria for receiving a consumer's license shall be as follows. Now, this is true in the context of people who are carrying a license. Under this bill, there's no penalty for soliciting a sex worker if you don't have a license. This just states this in this way so that because it's referring specifically to the act of a licensed practice. The individual must, so this is in order to receive a service recipient's license, the individual must be at least 18 years of age or older and of sound mind. Specific exceptions can be made to of sound mind if a professionally licensed caretaker can reasonably advocate for the positive effect that sexual services may have on a disabled individual, such as sex therapy for individuals with disabilities. So there are individuals who, maybe have Down syndrome or who are autistic, who are clearly not of sound mind and are incapable of traditionally accepted rational behavior. And this provides a mechanism for a representative of that person, whether that's a caretaker or a parent or a professional who can communicate with somebody who's autistic, to work with them and see if they would like to receive sex services. And the reason this is important is because, disabled individuals have the same desire for affection that regular people do. And they sometimes have a hard time acquiring it because they have a harder time communicating the same way that we do. And this would allow them to receive those services.
And a lot of folks with disabilities have trouble dating because people think they're taking advantage of them when they're dating them. And so there's like this whole power imbalance that totally is negated in this situation, which I really appreciate.
Item number 2 here on section 5. The individual and or their caretaker must submit to a background check in an effort to ensure the safety of sex workers. So that way, if a sex worker is practicing licensed and they're working with licensed recipients, they know that the people they're working with don't have a violent criminal background. Number 3, the individual and or their caretaker must offer their fingerprints to be registered in the state database in an effort to continually protect sex workers. If that individual becomes violent with a sex worker, this allows the state to protect the sex worker in the event that happens. Number 4, the individual consumer and or their caretaker must agree to be solely and wholly responsible for any and all forms of birth control to be used in any sexual interaction with a sex worker. Failure of a consumer and or a caretaker to adequately provide for the birth control of any interaction to result in the acceptance of any monetary responsibility associated with the accidental birth of an individual or the monetary expense associated with an abortion if the sex worker so chooses. The choice of whether or not to receive an abortion shall be the sex worker's regardless of gender. If a sex worker impregnates a customer or a consumer, the consumer may insist on keeping the child. However, the sex worker will not be responsible financially or otherwise for the care of the child. So this one I expect is going to be there's a debate to be had with this one on both sides of the fence. And, we can't resolve this in a bubble. So I guess for those of you who are watching, read this and let us know in the comments how you think that should be. And we'll review it and take it into consideration and continue to work with various community stakeholders on that. But we can't just be silent on it. That certainly needs to be addressed in some regard. One side or the other has to be responsible.
Yeah, the libertarian in me the libertarian in me, right, wants to suggest that we just leave it up to the person writing the contract and signing the contract. But you're right.
The
People aren't
agreement.
always going to think of that. Yeah.
Oops. No, that's great. And what it could be is that this section or this law that we're trying to write here could say that as a requirement for two licensees to engage in a sex transaction, whatever agreement they come up with must have a provision in it for this. And then those individuals can agree to it however they like, and the state can stay uninvolved and merely enforce whatever they agree to. So
I appreciate
that's a great
that.
point.
Or even just use this as a fallback. So if they choose not to, this is their.
Yeah, this is the default if they don't choose something different. So yeah, I'll add a note about that. This will fall back to consumer agreements. There we go. And then the next one here, individual must be free of STDs and STIs and submit a report every 30 days. Consumer license, and this section will be added up above, but a consumer license and a sex worker license may still be issued. However, disclosure will carry on the license that says if they have any STDs or not.
Mm-hmm.
In order to provide for funding of the DOL Sex Worker Administration Program and in an effort to alleviate the social stigma associated with sex work, state sales taxes and or excise taxes will be assessed over and above the charges for sex work services rendered. The sales tax will first be used to fund the DOL licensing program as outlined in this bill, and any excess funds shall be used for the sole purpose of facilitating social programs to help rehabilitate members of the homeless community, offer therapy and support victims of abuse to assist in finding them jobs. So this program is similar to the program outlined in this new bill that the Washington state has already approved. And the section of this bill which provides for this funding becomes effective 2024. So in other words, and I think that's important because I think in order to understand if there's going to be enough money to provide for these services, one, or what the excise tax rate should be, you kind of have to do this for 4 years to find that out, because it's not like you can do a market study and determine how much revenue this is going to generate, because nobody's going to participate now. Yeah. So I think I'd like to amend this to say that the sales tax will be collected in the first 4 years of this program being active. And then some committee would be formed to assess whether or not that tax needs to go up or down and determine how best to use those funds to fund these social programs. And that is pretty consistent with what's written in here. However, this new bill actually doesn't provide any definition of where the funding is coming from for the social programs it wants. Peculiar. Yeah, and we don't have income taxes in the state. So anyway.
I do appreciate that it says no funds derived from the sex workers sales tax shall be used for any other purpose. That's very important in this state.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's also incredibly important for libertarians, right? We are purveyors of voluntary exchange, and even we don't like big government, of course, and I'm more moderate libertarian than most, but if you're going to charge a tax, it ought to be a sales tax or an excise tax. And that sales tax or excise tax better be used for what you say it's supposed to be used for.
Amen, brother.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what that's supposed to do. This next one here is all transactions related to sex work shall be arranged in writing prior to services rendered. Now, while we were working with various community stakeholders, there was a bit of an objection to this, but that's kind of a tough one because, in order for value to remain subjective, kind of like what we talked about here with this birth control situation, and in order for people to have the freedom to do what they will with each other and have that enforced liberally, it has to be in writing. Otherwise, the state doesn't really have, it's just he said, she said, if you don't have something in writing or some form of documentation that outlines what you agreed to. Things get pretty tyrannical pretty quick if you just start assuming things and the state starts locking people up and shooting people for it. So I'm not sure there's any way around having to have some form of agreement in place. But if this is legal for any period of time, I can pretty much guarantee there's going to be 10 attorneys willing to write those things for free.
Yeah. No, I think that's necessary, because otherwise then you're getting into like a dude suing a chick for not providing services on a date, right? Like you paid her in
Yeah,
advance and then she didn't, like, yeah, in
yeah,
writing
that's a
certainly
mess.
seems
If you're
best.
gonna
Yeah.
have a, yeah. Uh, Any failure to pay a sex worker in full or work out a payment plan for services rendered within 90 days of an invoice shall constitute rape in the third degree, a Class C felony. A sex worker shall act reasonably and in good faith to facilitate a payment plan when possible. If undefined, interest under this payment plan shall accrue at 1.5% per month or 18% per annum.
Oh, but
This
how much
section,
time do they? Oh, 90. Okay.
90 days.
Okay.
Yeah, that could get shorter too. If you think that should be shorter, let us know in the comments. But, you know,
Yeah, I have no
people
idea what it
usually,
should be. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you know, part of this is my own bias because I'm a contractor, and
Mhm.
in my world, lien rights expire after 90 days. So 90 days is kind of just the threshold that's ingrained in my own brain. But if you think it should be something different, I'm sure it could change.
Yeah. I know we've talked about that in relation to healthcare too, just making sure that payments are made in a timely manner. So I like that 90 days for all of those things. Or in
Um,
healthcare, it's making sure you receive the bill within 90 days, I think is what you've been
that's
talking
right.
about.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you could receive a bill 2 years later and still have to pay it in that case.
Yeah.
It's a whole other video. You know,
Yeah.
as an aside, if you like the format of what we're doing here in this video, looking at these documents, we could probably do the same thing for the last 2 videos we did, because we have these proposals for everything we've already talked about. We just haven't gone through them in this detail. So let us know if that's something you want us to do.
I mean, I already vote for it, so.
Oh, okay.
Other people vote for it too. I like it.
Yeah. So the section related to interest shall not apply if a written agreement has not documented the transaction. So this whole section related to interest and rape shall not apply if a written agreement has not documented the transaction. The sex worker holds the burden of ensuring a written agreement is facilitated. In other words, it's difficult for the state. Let's say 2 people have sex outside of this license program because it's decriminalized in this case. And, you know, somebody makes a claim that they didn't get paid, although they may have gotten paid in cash, and the state has no way of validating that.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you could have a situation in which somebody is accusing somebody else of rape without any ability to prove it. And, you know, this licensed program creates a mechanism to prove it effectively, which hopefully takes, you know, some percentage of that argument out of it. But if nobody's licensed, the state doesn't really have the ability to defend any verbal agreements. This just outlines that. And then the current law as written is repealed and replaced with this.
Cool.
So that's kind of the mechanisms that we've outlined here. The merits, of course, are that it makes it easier to fight sex trafficking, because now people who have historically been coerced don't have to fear going to the government and asking for help, number one. Number two, it helps keep people off the street because we can charge excise taxes in an effort to facilitate social programs for people who have been abused, and do so without the need for income taxes, which should appeal to both sides of the party.
Yeah.
And also, from a right-wing perspective, this will create jobs. Undeniably, you could theoretically have a whole industry built. You're going to have attorneys, CPAs, licensed workers. You have a whole industry built around this that can ultimately do a lot of good for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, not a lot of people know, but Seattle was built on the backs of women on their backs. So you're welcome.
That's right. Yeah, they had more money than ever. They were almost the banks. Everybody got their loans from them to build everything you see today, and then you know, we turned around and made it illegal and put them in jail. So that's pretty messed up.
Yeah. Now you have to tell us your dog's name.
Oh, the dog's name's Hurley. He's a little wiener dog.
Harley the wiener dog.
Yeah.
Today we didn't have Rambo, the noisy collar cattle dog, so we have to, you know, substitute where we can, right?
There's got to be a dog in there regardless, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to read each of these. I'm just going to kind of highlight these based on memory. But principal adherence is, you know, how does this adhere to libertarian principles? And, you know, I appreciate that libertarians don't generally like big government, but I think first and foremost, we all recognize that consent and non-aggression is the primary principle of the party. consent between rational, informed individuals acting voluntarily. And in all cases, this checks that box. So it's a moderate proposal, and it's a bit of a compromise to the left in that it provides for social services, but it does so without income taxes. So I think that's that one.
Yeah, and primarily the services are primarily going towards the people using the industry that this is creating, right? So
that's right.
It's not anything that most of us wouldn't be fine with, I suppose, right? I hope.
Yeah,
Let us know in the comments.
Yeah. Potential left support. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. Not sure we need to talk too much about that.
Yeah.
Potential right support. We talked about that a little bit. Creates jobs. It's a market-driven solution.
Yeah, and honestly, like there have to be women. Like I'm not saying that I'm one of those women, but I certainly would feel more comfortable practicing sex work if a license were available, because then I would know that I was safe. So this has to be a win for a lot of women, just knowing that like they can be in an industry that makes a ton of money. Yeah. Hopefully maybe if they're good at it, but it just opens so many doors.
Yeah, that's interesting. You kind of have to. So first, we're getting into the morality part here a little bit, just by starting that conversation.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of people who look at prostitution as though it's a sin. And I want those people to know that I'm not going to try and convince them that they're wrong here. And I think I'm going to try and outline the reasonable arguments you can make against prostitution. And, that has historically been that it's a service which does not add material value to the market economy. And while that's true, so is serving coffee or being a waiter,
mowing lawns.
Mowing lawns. I mean, our economy was once in dire need of, Anyway, we have a service-driven economy now, so that one's kind of gone away. And then, of course, that there's a certain sanctity in sex itself that some people might feel is violated by choosing to sell it. And, whether or not that's true, in my opinion, is almost irrelevant, because in a liberally enlightened society, we need to let people take those risks. And it's kind of up to them to decide whether or not that risk is worth it. And these individuals, in many cases, are taking that risk in an effort to provide for themselves, their families, and now provide for the community. So there's a certain cost-benefit analysis that has to happen there, and it's unfair for society to make that for people. So even if you are a conservative that thinks sex work is wrong, I think at a minimum you respect freedom, but free will and free thought. And so I ask that you give these people their free will, and they can create a market around it.
Yeah, and really, I can foresee, safe spaces opening up for women to practice out of, much like they did in the early Seattle, where they could rent a room like a hair salon, right? So with prostitution becoming legal, they'll have the perfect places to protest out front of, because they might all just be in the same building. So.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but sure. But also one other thing you mentioned here about wages. Yeah. So, a lot of people complain about the wage gap from a left-wing perspective, and they want the government to step in and mandate equal pay for equal work. Well, in a system of merit, I think in sex work, women generally have more merit than men, and generally make a lot more money than men. And in an environment where a man is paying a woman, I don't know what it costs to hire a sex worker, but I imagine it's hundreds of dollars an hour for an hour of somebody's time, then you can't be a left person who insists that generating a profit is exploitation, and then also insist that hiring a prostitute is exploitation. It's like, wait a second, who's exploiting who there? Because the prostitute's making a lot of money.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's the comments for the left and for the right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah. So what are the next steps? What are the next steps for this bill? So we've got the letter of intent, and I know we go over this every time. I just want to make sure everyone knows what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're trying, we've got a limited budget, number one. So you can help first by making our budget bigger. That'd be great.
You can
Number
donate at
two,
lpwa.org.
yes,
or
thank you.
LPWA.
Number two, because we have a limited budget, you've seen three of these proposals now, I think maybe four. And we don't have the money to turn all these into real laws drafted by our attorney. So we're trying to use this venue here on YouTube to determine which one we should start with and which one's going to get the most support, and which one we should commit resources to. So, like the videos, number one, watch the videos, but whichever of these videos gets the most views and the most likes is probably going to be the one that we ultimately end up turning into a real bill. Once we turn it into a real bill, I'm going to send it out to various special interest groups and organizations and ask for sponsorship. In this case, places like the police department, maybe trade unions, maybe not trade unions, I don't know yet, but we'll send it out to various groups of people, ask for sponsorship and donations, and then that will hopefully provide us a venue where we can send this to state legislators and lobby them to pass a law, approximating something like this, number one. And two, also offer representatives who wish to run on the libertarian platform laws that they can take to the state legislature if they win.
Yeah, and that's huge for libertarians too, because we don't always run. A lot of times we run as paper candidates, right? With no issues, just to get our name out. So like, even if you want to run as a paper candidate, having issues to talk about, still better than just being on the ballot. So.
Yes, and now we've got three. We did healthcare. We did this one, which is sex work and homelessness.
Yeah.
And then we did housing. That's the other one. And actually, we've added one. I've added one section to our housing bill. I don't know if you heard, but California recently made it, or is going to make it, illegal to have single-family zoning in cities statewide.
Oh.
Yeah, which is interesting. So I'm exploring putting that in our housing bill as well.
I don't like the idea that it's illegal, but I suppose I appreciate that more than them not allowing multifamily housing. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that's from a libertarian perspective, it's interesting because the state is mandating what cities can do on their land. However, that mandate is done in an effort to protect an individual's ability to build whatever they want. So, I think it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I don't hate it, but we'll talk about that in another one.
Sure. So like and subscribe.
Yeah. Any last words from anyone other than Harley?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Cobi, and we'll get this up sometime in the next couple weeks, probably. So.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. Bye.